Our good friend James White is at it again. In this video, I want to go through and show you something that James White tweeted at me, and I think he thought he had a gotcha moment. But we'll go through and just examine what he's claiming with what the actual historical evidence seems to suggest. And then at the end, you can make your own decision as if James White is correct about this or not, or even if he is correct, if that means what he thinks it means. So first of all, let's take a look at this tweet and let's just dive right in. So I tweeted, and this is just tongue-in-cheek. This really wasn't supposed to be a hardcore apologetic tweet, but I just said, if you love the Bible, you should be Catholic. We have 7 more books to love. And obviously, this is not a great apology for the Catholic faith. This is just me being a little silly. And one of the comments in here made the point that the Orthodox have even more books in their Bible than Catholics do, so you should be Orthodox. Granted, I get it. This was tongue-in-cheek, not meant to be a serious post. But then our friend James White says this. Shout out to all these people who commented on my post, by the way. You guys rock. Thank you. James White said this way down here. Except, he's Whitebeard on Twitter, and you can understand why. He said, except those books were never considered canonical by God's people, quote, to whom the oracles of God were committed, in Paul's words. So James White is making a claim here that God's people, the Jews, never considered those books, namely the Deuterocanon, so that would be Wisdom, 1-2 Maccabees, Judith, and some others. They never considered those books to be canonical. And I dispute that point. I dispute that point heavily. Basically, in order for the Protestant biblical canon to work, you have to accept the fact that the Jews had a closed canon in the first century whenever Jesus was alive, that their canon was definitively closed and there was no question. And since the Jews are the maintainers of the oracles of God, since they're the keepers of the Old Testament, they hand that on to Christians in the New Testament, and that's why we have the 66 book canon that Protestants hold today. That's basically what you have to hold as a Protestant, because if it's an open question in the first century, then the Christian church is the one that closes the question, right? Monotheism is already a closed question in the Old Testament, and so that's handed on to the New Testament. So it doesn't have to be reopened. It's simply the case. It's settled in the Old Testament and it's handed on to the New. So in order for the Bible to work the same way, it has to be a settled question that there's a 66 book canon, right? 66 minus 27. How many books are in the Protestant Old Testament? I don't know. Somebody else can do the math and leave a comment. But there's a closed canon of this many books in the Old Testament that the Jews decided definitively before Christ arrived, and that's handed on to the New Testament people. That's what you have to have as a Protestant to hold your canon, because the Christian church in the first few centuries, and I'm going to show you exactly where they teach this, but the Christian church in the first few centuries holds that there are inspired books that were not in the Jewish canon, or at least not the Jewish canon that we accept today. Furthermore, I'm going to show you, I got the receipts, I can show you, that there were Jews in the first century who disputed the canon. In fact, it was a wildly disputed question. Jimmy Akin has a book called The Bible is a Catholic Book. I'll put the link in the description. You can check that out. But he goes through and details a lot of this history, and it was actually an incredibly complex issue that the Jews didn't have settled until after the Christians had closed their canon. The Jews closed their canon in large part as a response to the Christians closing their canon. So there's a lot that we're going to cover here. Stay tuned. This is going to be great. If you have questions about the canon, I think this video is going to clear them up for you. And also to James White, not trying to make him look bad or anything like that, but I think that he is at a point where he needs to do some serious prayer, some serious investigation into his interior life, because it seems to me, whenever I've seen him speak, his motu proprio, his go-to instinct is always to assume the church is wrong and then build an argument in that direction. I think one of the things that some Protestant apologists do well is be like, yeah, the Christian church, the Catholic church, makes a lot of sense on this point. And I could see, I actually agree with Catholics about this point, about the real presence or Mary or the importance of the church or the canon. I agree with them on that point. And sometimes Protestants will start to see some Catholic truths and they'll realize how reasonable it is, how preeminently reasonable Catholicism is, and that lends him a lot of credibility. For James White, all I've seen him do, and maybe I'm just watching the wrong clips, granted, but all I've seen him do is kind of tear down Catholic arguments. He seems to start with the presupposition that whatever Catholicism teaches is false, therefore I need to go in the other direction. But I digress. Let's look at this canon tweet. Let's look at this biblical canon in the first century and see what points we can make. And the first point is, I think this is just interesting to think about, but to this day, the Jews ought not have an end to public revelation. Why? Because the Jews are still looking forward to the Christ, the Messiah. It hasn't been revealed to them who the Christ is. So in a certain sense, they shouldn't have a defined set of revelation, because we know of at least one revelation for Jews, if you're working with the Jewish mindset, that hasn't been revealed yet, and that is the identity of the Christ and his mother. So Jews should not have a closed set of revelations, because Jews know that there's at least one more revelation coming. So the idea that Jews can kind of close their canon, in a certain sense, it's illogical. Because if you're going to say that there is no more public revelation that you expect, then you should know who the Christ is. Jews don't know who the Christ is. And so this idea that they have a closed canon in the century doesn't make much sense from that perspective. I want to look at some historical data here, but that's just something to think about before we go into this. Second point here. There is a book called Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls by Brant Petrie. Wonderful book, but he details this in a lot more color. If you want to really go into this and see it, I'll put the link in the description. Check out that book. I highly recommend it. I really enjoyed that read. But he lays out the point that during the time of Christ, there were three different camps of Jews, more or less. There were the Sadducees, and the Sadducees didn't accept the idea that there were angels or spirits. They were very kind of materialistic, and they viewed the Torah more as a set of rules to perfect human nature, but they didn't really have a supernatural lens. They did not accept many of the books that the Pharisees accepted. And the Pharisees had a bigger canon. They accepted the Torah, they accepted the prophets, and they accepted several other sacred writings. It seems like we don't have an exact list of what the Sadducees believed, but it seems like their canon was limited more or less to the Torah. So you look at this, whenever the Sadducees come to Jesus and they say, look, this woman, she married 7 different men, and each of these men had her. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And Jesus says, you don't understand anything. And rather than quoting Ezekiel, where it's obvious that there's a resurrection of the body, he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. Why? Because he's talking to Sadducees. Sadducees don't accept Ezekiel as inspired. And so the famous prophecy in Ezekiel where the bones come back to life, which is an obvious allusion to the resurrection of the body, Jesus doesn't quote that. Instead, he takes a somewhat convoluted passage from the Old Testament and says, I am the God of the living, not the dead, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, etc., etc. So he takes this passage from the Old Testament, from the Torah, to prove that Jacob and Isaac are still living, rather than quoting the somewhat obvious one about the resurrection of the body in Ezekiel. Why is he using this sort of roundabout argument for the resurrection instead of just using the obvious passage? It's because the Sadducees don't accept Ezekiel as inspired, or at least they hold it very dubiously. Because the point here is I don't have to prove that all Jews accepted the Deuterocanon as scripture. I don't need to prove that. The Christian church from the first few centuries settles that. All I have to prove is that it's at least an open question. And there's one formidable group of Jews, the Sadducees, who were disputing this with the Pharisees. So the Pharisees, once again, they don't have an exact closed canon where there's hard defined rules as to what's scripture or what's not. Just take a look at what is in the Septuagint. The Septuagint, you have a bunch of books that are inspired and a few that are not. So for example, 1st Enoch is included in several copies of the Septuagint. 1st Enoch, Catholics and Protestants today agree is not inspired, but it's in the Septuagint for several copies, right? So in the Septuagint, you have all these texts, and there's dispute about which of these are inspired or not. Some people agree are just simply inspired. The Torah, everyone agrees that's inspired. There's really no question about that. But something like 1st Enoch, some Jews accept that as inspired, some do not in the 1st century at the time of Christ. Sirach, the Wisdom of Ben Sira is what it's sometimes called. That book is considered by some to be inspired, and it's in the Septuagint, and it's included in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll get to in just a second. That's a really compelling point. But some people do not accept that as inspired, but it's dubious. There's this sort of fluidity in the canon. It's not hard and set parameters. There's certain books everyone agrees upon, and there's certain books that some communities accept and some do not. And then the third group, you have the Sadducees, which had a very small canon, the Pharisees, which was still a little fuzzy as to what they believed, but their canon corresponded very, very closely to the Protestant canon today. And then you have the Essenes, and the Essenes are a community that's not directly referenced in the Bible. The word Essenes, at least, isn't in the Bible, but you see some of these Essenes popping up throughout the scriptures, and while they're never identified as Essenes exactly, that's quite obviously what they are. These Essenes were sort of like proto-religious. They lived in the mountain. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. They lived in this mountain in a community, and they awaited the coming of the Messiah. And these Jews had a very broad sense of scripture. They accepted all the Deuterocanonical books. They accepted 1st Jubilees. They accepted 1st Enoch. Enoch, they accepted a lot of books as inspired. So you have these three communities. The Pharisees seem to have the closest to the Protestant canon today, but many of the Pharisees accepted at least Sirach and several other of the Deuterocanonical books as inspired scripture. In fact, the Talmud, the Jewish book, the Talmud, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, actually quotes Sirach, a Deuterocanonical book, as if it were scripture. So we can see, even in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, this canon is not clearly defined. But even if we suppose that it was well known that the Jews, while Christ was alive, had rejected the Deuterocanonical books, that doesn't matter that much, because the Christians in the first few centuries did accept these books as inspired. For example, Saint Clement, who's mentioned in the Bible, who's a friend and co-worker with Saint Paul. Saint Clement quotes both Judith and Wisdom, the Book of Wisdom, two Deuterocanonical books. He quotes both of them in an epistle that he wrote maybe in the year 70 to 90 AD, very, very early in the first century. He's writing and quoting both Wisdom and Judith as inspired scripture. This is a man who was appointed to the bishopric, appointed to the papacy by the apostles and their successors. This is a man who knew St. Paul in the flesh, and he's quoting both Judith and Wisdom in his epistle, 1 Clement. So to recap what we've covered so far, the Jews had an open canon in the 1st century. The Essenes, Sadducees, and Pharisees were not settled concretely upon what the canon was. The Deuterocanonical books were included in the Septuagint, which indicates that those books were considered, at least by some, to be inspired. Once again, I'm not saying the Jews all accepted the Deuterocanonical as inspired. That's not the argument I need to make. I just need to make the point that some Jews accepted them as canonical. Some Jews accepted them as inspired. It was an open question whenever the authority to make these decisions was transferred from the Jews to the Christians. And then in the 1st century, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, we see all the apostolic fathers, or at least many of them, are quoting from these Deuterocanonical books. 1st Clement is the most obvious. He quotes both Judith and Wisdom as if they are scripture. And I also just want to point out, this is a pretty complex question. It certainly was not resolved by Jews in the 1st century. However, if you fast forward and just look at the complexity a little bit, Jude, the Epistle of Jude, quotes 1st Enoch, which is a book included in the Septuagint. It quotes 1st Enoch as if it were scripture. It's really a strange thing. 1st Enoch is not considered inspired, but it's quoted by an inspired text, and it's included in the Septuagint. Yet all Christians today would agree that 1st Enoch does not belong in the Bible. It's a very complex issue, and this is why, since it's not settled by Jews in the 1st century, it has to be settled by the Christian church, the Catholic Church, in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. And you see this canon starting to solidify and get really crystal clear by the 4th century with the Council of Rome. St. Augustine, in his book De Doctrina, he lists out this 73-book canon that we have today. That's where the Catholic canon comes from. It comes from the Jews having an open question in the 1st century. The authority to settle the dispute is transferred. The binding and loosing power is transferred from the seat of Moses to the chair of Peter. And then the 4th century is where we actually have a definitive ruling by the church as to what is in the scriptures and what is not. So I guess the question would be this. If you were in the 1st century, let's say you're in the year 100 AD, and a Jew comes up to you and says, Judith and the Wisdom of Solomon are not inspired. And Clement, who's a Christian, who knew St. Paul, comes up to you and says, no, actually Judith and Wisdom are both inspired scripture. Who are you going to side with? The Jew, who's at this point rejected Christ and stayed in a false religion at this point? Or Clement, who has given up everything to pursue the gospel, who conversed with the apostles frequently and knew St. Paul in the flesh? Who are you going to side with? For me, the decision's pretty obvious. And if you enjoyed that and you want to see a video where I explain why Catholicism is the only 100% biblical religion, then click on this video next. God bless.